Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're unpacking one of the most bizarre and honestly truly horrifying historical mysteries on record. I mean, just imagine walking out your front door on a blistering hot summer day. Instead of seeing your neighbors doing their usual daily chores, they're all caught up in this frantic, relentless, involuntary street rave. And the craziest part? They can't stop. Not to eat, not to drink, not even to sleep. We're traveling back to France to unravel Strasbourg's deadly 1518 dance crisis.
Okay, let's dive into this. The baffled city officials of Strasbourg were staring down a pretty terrifying question. Why on earth did 400 ordinary people suddenly take to the streets and start dancing, in the sweltering heat, literally right up to the brink of death? Look, this wasn't a festival. It definitely wasn't a celebration. It was this uncontrollable compulsion that swept through the city like a virus. But to understand how we even get to a crowd of 400 people, we really need to trace this whole thing back to day one.
And this contagion escalated with terrifying speed. It all kicked off on a hot July day with just a single German housewife named Frau Trophia. She stepped out of her house and just began to dance. There was no music playing, no holiday. She just danced all day, managed to grab maybe a few hours of restless sleep, and woke up to tap her bruised feet all over again. Now, at first, onlookers kind of just laughed and clapped, but by the end of week one, the laughing completely stopped. 34 other people had caught this so-called jitterbug and joined her. Fast forward just 1 month later, and 400 people are dancing relentlessly in the streets.
Now, I want to make one thing absolutely clear here. They were not having fun. This wasn't some medieval Coachella. The dancers were in pure agony. We're talking frothing at the mouth. Their feet were bruised, they were bleeding. Witnesses actually reported that these people were literally screaming out for mercy, begging for help from whatever unseen force was compelling them to move. They were completely unable to stop themselves, basically trapped inside their own bodies.
And the stakes of this straining affliction were incredibly grim. At the absolute peak of the plague, an estimated 15 people were dying every single day. The sweltering summer heat, combined with just extreme physical exertion, meant that the dancers were dropping dead in the streets from severe exhaustion and massive heart attacks. And the most disturbing part? When someone collapsed and died, the others couldn't even stop to help them. They just kept compulsively dancing right around the corpse.
Now you might be thinking this is just some exaggerated medieval myth, right? But it's not. And this brilliantly illustrates that fact. The Strasbourg Municipal Archive carefully documented this entire crisis as it unfolded in real time. They literally watched their citizens drop unconscious and pass away day and night. It was an absolute crisis management nightmare. And the city council? They had absolutely no idea what to do.
Which brings us to Section 1, the investigation, curing dance with more dance.
So first, they bring in the physicians and astrologers, who confidently diagnose the dancers with hot blood, basically a humoral imbalance that was overheating the brain. But since bloodletting wasn't exactly feasible on moving targets, their genius remedy was to prescribe more dancing. Yep, they actually built a giant public stage and hired professional musicians, hoping the victims would just burn themselves out. Total disaster. The fast-paced music just attracted more passersby to join in. Once they realized they'd essentially hosted a deadly block party, they went full footloose. Believing the whole thing was a punishment for sin, they outlawed gambling, shut down brothels, and even banned the playing of drums, which they thought might be triggering the madness. When all of that failed, they simply loaded the remaining dancers onto wagons and exiled them to a mountain shrine.
Moving on to Section 2, the false suspects, ruling out poison, disease, and sexism.
If you've ever gone down a rabbit hole about this case before, you've probably wondered, was it ergot poisoning? Or maybe an underlying medical disease like mass epilepsy? Ergot, if you don't know, is this mold that grows on damp rye grain. And when you eat it, it contains chemicals that are actually really similar to LSD, which can induce severe muscle spasms and wild hallucinations. So it sounds like a pretty plausible suspect, right? Well, let's test that theory. It turns out the ergot theory quickly falls apart. Yes, it causes spasms, for sure, but witnesses specifically described the victims performing highly coordinated rhythmic dancing, not just random convulsions. Plus, dancing plagues happen in regions where rye wasn't even a dietary staple. Okay, so what about disease? Well, things like epilepsy and typhus are simply not socially contagious. I mean, you can't catch a seizure just by looking at someone. And as for the theory that this was some sort of secret heretical dance cult, completely illogical. Cult members wouldn't dance themselves into sheer crying agony and fatal heart attacks right in the middle of a public square. Actually, I have to bring up this next point because it really highlights just how desperate and confused the medical community was at the time. A decade later, in 1526, the famous Renaissance physician Paracelsus decided to investigate the whole ordeal. And his professional medical conclusion? He blamed our original dancer, Frau Trophea. He claimed she was just engaging in forced natural dancing as a rebellious trick to avoid doing her household chores, and that she accidentally set off a citywide reflex. Right, because apparently bleeding out of your feet for days on end was preferable to a little medieval housework.
Let's get to Section 3, the true culprit, the perfect storm of trauma and human psychology.
So the crucial point is this. If it wasn't poisoned bread, if it wasn't an infectious physical disease, and it certainly wasn't an elaborate scheme to get out of doing chores, what actually happened? Well, modern psychology gives us a deeply compelling explanation. But to truly understand it, we have to look at the environment these people were living in. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously summed up the era with this quote, saying life, particularly for the peasantry, was unusually nasty, brutish, and short. To really understand the minds of the Strasbourg dancers, you have to build immense empathy for their daily reality. The Middle Ages were defined by endless war, disease, and brutal conditions. The people of Strasbourg were quite literally pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance.
And that brings us to this staggering number, 4. In the years immediately leading up to 1518, the citizens of Strasbourg had suffered through 4 severe back-to-back famines. In 1517, a time known literally as the bad year, food prices skyrocketed, making basic survival nearly impossible. On top of the starvation, they were getting hit by terrifying outbreaks of smallpox, leprosy, and this newly arrived horror called syphilis. The city's orphanage was completely overflowing with 300 new children. So the level of collective fear, anxiety, and trauma that was just blanketing this city was absolutely suffocating.
Which leads us to the psychological diagnosis modern researchers have pinned on this event, dissociative trance disorder, or DTD. It's an actual, recognized condition in the DSM-5 today. Essentially, when a person experiences profound, inescapable trauma, like, say, starving to death while your family dies of smallpox, the brain deploys an extreme defense mechanism. It forcefully disconnects a person's thoughts and memories from their physical actions. The victims in Strasbourg basically entered a trance state, losing their sense of identity as their awareness completely narrowed.
And the neuroscience behind DTD perfectly explains the bizarre symptoms we see in the historical records. When someone enters one of these voluntary or involuntary trances, brain activity literally shifts from the analytical left hemisphere over to the more experiential right hemisphere. This explains exactly why the dancers felt they were completely out of control of their own bodies. They felt compelled by an outside force to act. And crucially, during these trances, the brain releases a massive flood of natural opioids. This biological painkiller is the missing puzzle piece that explains how these everyday people could endure bleeding feet, torn muscles, and massive cardiac stress for weeks on end without collapsing in agony.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it jumped from 1 person to 400. That is the dark magic of behavioral contagion. See, conformity is just doing something to fit in with a crowd, but behavioral contagion, that happens when an entire population is already sharing a deep internal psychological conflict, in this case, immense extreme trauma and fear. When those traumatized citizens saw Frau Trophea manifest her trauma through a dissociated trance, it acted like a spark in a powder keg. Just like how a yawn is contagious, seeing someone enter a trauma-induced trance triggered a cascading psychological domino effect throughout the entire city.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 4, the St. Vitus Solution, a psychological cure for a psychological plague.
So if this was a mass psychogenic illness, a psychological plague, how did they finally put an end to it? Well, the cure is just as fascinating as the disease itself. You see, the forms that trances take are heavily influenced by a person's cultural beliefs. Over in the Rhine Valley, there was this widespread, terrifying superstition that a Catholic saint, Saint Vitus, would punish sinners by cursing them with uncontrollable dancing. Because the citizens of Strasbourg fully expected and feared this exact curse, their traumatized brains unconsciously selected it as the physical manifestation for their distress. Their culture provided the exact lens for their hysteria.
Let's see how this builds to the ultimate cure. Since the citizens fundamentally believed St. Vitus had caused the plague, their minds dictated that only St. Vitus could cure it. City officials finally abandoned their disastrous dance stages and hauled the afflicted in wagons up to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to the saint. Up there, priests held a solemn mass, granted the dancers absolution for their sins, and handed out small crosses and red shoes that had been blessed with holy oil. And like magic, it worked. This highly orchestrated, culturally accepted religious ritual acted as the ultimate psychological placebo. It put their guilty, terrified minds at ease, successfully breaking the trance and allowing them to finally regain control of their bodies.
The dancing plague of 1518 gradually died out by September, and it actually became the last major outbreak of its kind in Europe. But it leaves us with an incredibly powerful realization. The citizens of Strasbourg weren't faking it, and they definitely weren't poisoned. Their own brains, completely overwhelmed by the harshness of the reality, hijacked their bodies to dance away the trauma. So it leaves us with this final thought. If our minds possess the sheer power to force us to dance to the brink of death just to escape our trauma, what other bizarre, hidden things are our brains capable of making us do today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this dive into history has left you as fascinated by the human psyche as I am.